type of environment. So that was it. I wasn't going to talk for an hour, I swear. So I was going to make America great again down at the bottom of the chart, but do we have time for questions? Do we want to do some of that? 7 now. I can stand here and meditate. Oh, yeah.
Regarding infection, what are the things that they're finding are the greatest things to help reduce infection? Is there any correlation, for example, between air changes and infection rates?
So there's no known relationship or correlation between really, I would say, any ventilation variable and general infection rates. The exception to that, well, it's not really even an exception. Even in operating rooms, the study, it's difficult to prove that a certain level of air cleanliness has a direct effect on surgical site infection rates, right? There are some studies that show lower surgical site infection rates under clean air regimes, and then there's some other studies that prove. But the general, if you're like me, you probably grew up with this belief that, like, you know, the general air change rates in the patient room are there to prevent infections, and that just is unsupportable at any level. So to give you an example, one of the common general infections, if you had a family member in the hospital in the last year, is a catheter-associated urinary tract infection, right? And we track the numbers on those in a very specific way. What site did they occur in? What med center? What was the age of the patient? Like all the variables. But we don't track air changes because there's nothing to indicate. There's not even a rationale to believe how the hell could an air conditioning system prevent or cause a catheter-associated urinary tract infection. So that data is just not there.
What about for neutropenia? What about for like a immunocompromised patient, bone marrow transplant?
And that is the bona fide. If you do have the neutropenic patients or organ transplant patients, we don't do that. Most of your community hospitals and most of your insurance companies don't do that. So, like in Southern California, you won't find a protective environment for neutropenic patients or transplant patients, except for UCLA has one, and UCSD has one, and there may be one in the City of Hope. Yeah. But I mean, you're talking maybe 13 rooms for a population of 50 million people, and so it's very rare. But that's the other sort of bona fide case. And then airborne, so as an HVAC guy, I would have believed my whole life that, you know, there's thousands of diseases that can be transmitted through the air. You know, anything you can get, you can transmit through the air. Well, it turns out that there's really only about 5 that are recognized in the CDC literature as airborne transmitted diseases. It's chickenpox, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, mumps, rubella. So it's a very, very short list. And so when we talk to our infection control folks, by the way, if y'all are as old as me, you may not know that the chickenpox vaccine worked out awesomely. And we all got chickenpox when we were kids, and my kids are not getting it. And so that's severely reduced the caseload. So what we're finding right now is that we're over-programmed with isolation spaces. We have these isolation rooms, you know, where we have to have one isolation room for every 30 rooms, and we never use them for isolation cases. And so the med group wants the ability to put normal patients in there and look at them and keep the door open and stuff. So, yep.
The rooms that are not occupied, why are they opposed to not bringing those air regimes to a lower rate if they're monitoring the quality in the room? Why are they opposing to not being able to lower the?
Yeah, that's just been a tough thing to write into the code. So at the national standard level, it breaks down into a couple questions. If you have a lighting occupancy sensor in a patient room, then when the lighting occupancy sensor shuts off or the room is bona fide unoccupied, then you can turn down the systems. Under California code, you can turn down the systems to, I think, 20% is the number like that. But patient rooms are very frequently not unoccupied. They have somebody in them, that person is just asleep, right? And so all the lights are off and the guy's asleep. That's not an unoccupied room. So one of the interesting things would be if and when we do rethink how in patient rooms, then that could open up the door to an interesting case of demand control ventilation, right? Because when you're sleeping, you don't actually produce very much, so a trickle of air in that room is likely going to maintain air quality just fine. But we haven't, the code structure that we have now doesn't allow any of those performance-based alternatives. We'll start with Chris, and then we'll come on.
So on the rooms that you have the ability to turn down ventilation rates, like administration and those types of rooms, you mentioned that ASHRAE isn't so gung ho on going VAV. Is it because of the balance of that room versus the other rooms in the area, and putting in return boxes to control?
Yeah, so ASHRAE has some special rules that are unique to the California code. And rule number 1 is that you have to have a return air VAV box for every fire VAV box, which kind of makes VAV economically unfeasible, particularly in the existing portfolio. In order to do a VAV conversion of our admin wing, ostensibly by the code, we'd need to go in and add return air VAV boxes. Well, that's a multi-million-dollar project. It's not going to happen, right? And then the second rule that they have is related to that, and they call it the corridor rule, where the California code has some verbiage in there that essentially says, thou shalt not ever let a drop of air move to or from any corridor from any other space, right? And so those two lines of code make VAV systems tough in California. They are code, and so the work that we've been doing in the last year is proposing alternatives to those rules, and we've been pretty successful in that, moderately successful in that. But I think that's where the long-term conversation, the fact that hospitals are now under Title 24 means that OSHPD officials and Energy Commission officials are now trapped in the same rooms writing the next versions of the energy code indefinitely for the next 10 code cycles, right? And so that stuff will, there's a different future for that stuff. Right? Yeah.
Travis, that slide you had where you showed the top 10 best energy hospitals you guys have.
Yeah.
Were there lessons learned? Were there common things that those hospitals had that others didn't?
A little bit. It's a lot of it has to do with the site operators. So just a deal capturing opportunities, that's important. In terms of systems, the stuff that you're looking for, the cogeneration systems are heavier in the top 10 than they are in the bottom 10. The system that I can tell you is a dead bust are thermal fluid heaters. We have, I think, 4 sites with thermal fluid heaters, and they are all soundly in the bottom 10. Those things are burning energy like it was still in style. And
is the geographical location a factor?
that's the one thing that it's very difficult to explain. So I'll say this, and you won't believe me. Our energy data is not correlated to the weather. So that's true. Like even summer to winter months, we just burn a base level of natural gas kind of all year long, right? Because most of the energy that we're using, fan and cooling and reheat energy, is disassociated to the weather. So you do see on some sites we literally cannot to the heating degree days or cooling degree days. Yeah, but some of them you can, but the slope of the curve is terrible. It's embarrassing. Yeah.
So actually I have 2 questions. One of them is, do you have any publications for yours, or any plans for publications for your specific best practices based on your top, or any plans for publications for your specific best practices based on your top 10 list?
I don't know. I write papers twice a year because then I get into the annual conferences for $100 rather than, and I do stash those all on a website, because the author's copy can go on a website, so you can have all of that. It is a cure for insomnia. Read to your. I have tens of readers really in my audience.
So my second question was about you mentioned the VAV system having a good supply and return. Have you tried that in any of your kind of experimental cases?
VAV without return boxes?
No, but like with the supply and return to see if that, or how that would affect your performance and if it would end up on the top 10 list.
We know that VAV works. So in our Oregon hospital, the simple exercise of which I believe will become available next year in California, assuming you're willing to do some variance work, of just converting all your admin spaces to VAV. That's kind of a slam dunk. We did that in our Oregon facility, over the course of a couple weekends. We call that a programming only project. We literally didn't bring a contractor in. You just sit on the computer and reprogram it. And it works. You'll knock down the energy intensity of those spaces. In terms of the return air boxes, we do have some facilities that have, supply and return air boxes. From what I understand from those facilities engineers, so we talked about sequence of operations for VAV boxes upstairs. The correct sequence of operations for tamper out or disconnect the wires and throw them. It's what I hear.
Works in the pharmacies, though.
Yeah. Jorge.
I got a question, Frank. So, back on your slide of reheat being, one of the biggest indicators of I'm very curious to understand why didn't the heat recovery chillers help strategize the reduction on the reheat side of it.
Yep.
And I kind of see it a little bit from a biased perspective, but there's two things.
Wait, you don't sell chillers?
In my mind, it's a twofold strategy. So there's the reheat, and then there's also the set point.
Yeah.
So it only gets you to a certain point.
Right.
So did you guys look at the reduction of that set point of the hot water side to also attenuate from?
I don't actually know the details of how they set it. So we do have the two sites with the heat recovery chillers. One of them made the top 10 list and the other one didn't. The one that did make the top 10 list, it took 18 months to get those heat recovery chillers online where they worked for more than a 24-hour period in a row. And at that point, we did see, once they started working, we did see a reduction in the EOI of that facility. Like you could see that month in the bills, it dropped down. And it dropped down, I want to say it was about a 20% reduction. We're still burning a lot of natural gas there because I'm sure, think about it for a while. You got to base load that heat recovery chiller. So you're in the base load, right? And that was just the case.
It's my other point where I love the strategy of the generation. I consider maybe waste. What are you over-generating on the cooling or heating side? And then the waste on the usage, which is your, air changes and all that stuff. But then the operation, I think that's what really ties all this strategy you're talking about. So heat recovery or whatever strategy is you got to hit the generation side. You got to hit the usage side, and you got to put some sort of an operation strategy on it. So I think changing the tables and all that stuff is fantastic, but the operation, I think, is key.
Right. So Bosses talks about you just got to be brilliant at the basics, right? We don't need the most. The other one I'll mention is chiller optimization packages. We have chiller optimization packages on, I think, 7 hospitals, and only one of them made the top 10. and so we don't necessarily have this chiller optimization scheme that you have. You just need to have, basic blocking and tackling has to be done well on both the air side systems and the central plant systems, right? We don't need to overpromise on that stuff. We just need to be good at the basics and deliver on it in a sound way, and then just be sensible about what we're doing. I think. How's time? We're over? Okay. Excellent. All right, well, I'll shut up.